Welcome, everyone, and we're thrilled to have you join our webinar today on the topic of clinical variation reduction, also known as CVR, Strategy to Drive Value. This is part one series of our two-part program, and I am Robin Furlong. I will be today's moderator for this webinar, being sponsored by Clinical Intelligence. I want to introduce to you today two fabulous speakers. First of all, Laurie Jaccard, who is our founder and president of Clinical Intelligence. Laurie has founded CI back in 2001, and CI serves as a national market leader in transforming and optimizing clinical performance for hospitals and care delivery networks to create sustainable value through applied analytics, advanced care management, and clinical variation reduction initiatives with ClinView. CI's cloud-based software as a service platform helps CI clients realize return on investment by creating actionable insight. CI has led more than 150 rapid cycle assessments, implementations, and sustained engagements. Laurie began her career as a registered nurse working 15 years in the clinical areas of ED, ICU, and level 1 trauma centers in the clinic. She specializes in system quality improvement, champion enterprise performance improvement, centers of excellence, service line planning, care management, and evidence-based population health. She is a visionary. She's passionate about improving our healthcare system in the United States and building solutions and teams and inspiring that change. Our other co-presenter today is Doug Morell. Doug is the co-founder and managing partner of Impenza Advisors. Doug Morell brings over 40 years of cost accounting and finance decision support experience to bear on client engagements. He has previously worked in a variety of organization types for healthcare organizations and providers. He works with software vendors, boutique, and big three consulting service firms. He is a national thought leader on cost accounting in healthcare, having assisted over 200 organizations develop and refine their cost accounting processes. Doug's intimate knowledge of hospital operation helps clients quickly reach optimal use of cost accounting information. Doug has a bachelor's degree in science, health system engineering from Georgia Institute of Technology. He is an active in HFMA and HIMSS and was the founding member of the Gateway St. Louis HIMSS chapter. So thank you again, and let's begin this exciting webinar series.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining this webinar. We're going to be discussing clinical variation strategy. Why is it so important, and how to activate your clinical variation program for your enterprise and facility? We're going to share some examples from the field of how various organizations have leveraged their patient level encounter and their financial data to create enterprise business intelligence. We're going to be focusing in on the importance of having the right granularity of costing to study clinical variation. And we're going to share some examples from our clients over the last 10 years. None of these slides represent one single client. Reducing clinical variation is definitely an art and a science. It's tough. It takes a lot of discipline to organize the data, to study the utilization of this healthcare service, and to focus in on the quality and the cost containment. Every organization that we work with has clinical variation. We all have variation, and we all have normal variation just because of the nature of the patients are different. Their severities are different. But what we focus on are areas of unwarranted variation, those areas that aren't reflective of clinical variation, but more resource utilization or practice pattern. So here in this presentation, we'd like to really focus in on clinical variation within your organization. And really throughout this presentation, we'll be interjecting some reflection points. So the first reflection point is thinking about your organization. How much variation exists within your enterprise? Would you say none till very little, low levels, medium, or high? most likely you're in the medium to high levels of variation. Variation can be quite significant. Why is this so important? When we look at clinical variation, we can improve upon quality, we can improve upon the patient safety, physician engagement, and also realize cost reduction from this and revenue integrity from looking at clinical variation. So many people ask, how do you start to build a clinical variation program? Taking a programmatic approach is really key. It starts with the leadership, looking at the readiness of the program itself. Do we have a crystal clear vision for the clinical variation program? Do we have the, the medical staff engagement? Do we have the data ready and a platform so we can study the variation and measure variation across the implementation phase? And do we have a way to measure our success? So we're going to focus on some nuts and bolts of the clinical variation program. And one of those is that organizational governance. Do we have a right structure in place? Many times hospitals will leverage their utilization management committees for this. You might leverage your P&T committee or develop your medical staff committee around clinical variation. There's a lot of different ways that the governance can be established, and there's not any right or wrong. The other key staple is to ensure that you have the right resources. Do you have the right people, the project managers, leaders, the time? Is this going to be the right timing for you to start this program, or will you be competing with other strategies? Collaboration and tools are really key. The data discovery is very important. The people trained, the analysts that are involved in this, they all have to be ready to work with you on the program. And I cannot stress enough the importance of provider engagement. We really cannot study clinical variation without physician champions leading the way. Just like any evidence-based strategy, you must be a practicing physician for you to really understand evidence-based medicine and the components. So these are four key components of the readiness phase. The vision and the culture are very important as well. Many times our clients will want to launch a clinical variation program, but they think it's really focused in on cost reduction, and that's very challenging when you don't have an established commitment to quality. Um, so if you look at clinical variation as removing the waste and undesired um, outcomes, then you really truly are focusing in on improving the quality of that patient care. And typically what will happen is the cost will follow. The direct cost will be removed just by simply decreasing that variation out. So some key readiness questions to think about is are do you have a sponsor committed for the need to change? Is there a sponsor? Sponsors can range from a vice president of medical affairs, a chief medical officer. A sponsor could be an enterprise physician advisor to lead the change. A sponsor could be a dyad partnership, potentially between a chief financial officer and a chief medical officer. So there are different sponsors. A sponsor could be a population health executive, and even a sponsor can be a director of quality. Again, there's no right or wrong to the sponsors. It's just the sponsor needs to have a willingness to lead this engagement and the time to do so. Also, in your organization, when you think of clinical variation, you're thinking of hardwiring best practices with evidence-based medicine to create standard work. Are your medical staff already engaged in evidence-based processes? Is this something new? Do you have the right analytics and the critical thinking skills? So there's so much to think about when you shape the vision and the culture for the program. So if the program is grounded in the principles of performance improvement, it's really a stepwise approach. So if you define the opportunities and you can measure the opportunity and the impact of the change, and your teams can analyze and drill down into the data to identify root causes, you can see really this is the DMAIC methodology. Many hospitals use the DMAIC methodology, many hospitals use PDSA. Again, no right or wrong methodology, but if you follow the PI principles, it really helps you as you guide your programs. Also, when you are making change in your programs, you can deploy rapid cycle improvements, so you can test the change, and that's also a very helpful tool through the process of implementation and change acceleration. So with any clinical variation program, we take a look, clinical intelligence takes a look at the enterprise to determine what strength do you have within your care management structure, process, people, and outcomes. We believe that to layer clinical variation program on a organization that might have a weaker care management program might not be as effective as if you have a strong foundation. So the components of a strong foundation for care management include: do you have the right model? Do you have the right people with care managers and social workers? And are your medical staff and care management team effectively coordinating patient care? Do we have interdisciplinary teams coordinating patient care on a daily basis, such as multidisciplinary rounds where we talk about every patient every day, and we're coordinating patient care and discharge plans? That really does serve to create the highest pinnacle of quality, having a strong care management program in place. In addition, having the right fit analytics in place is very vital. Um, this becomes a source of truth for the project. This creates actionable insight, and this actually can integrate disparate data that typically exists in a hospital, bringing it together so we have a holistic approach to study clinical variation. So clinical variation really is a holistic study of the clinical, the quality, and the financial outcomes. And and are we holding teams accountable for the results? Do we have ways that we can measure and monitor performance? Have we, um, for example, created hospitalist incentives to perform at their very highest? Do we share the scorecards and dashboards back to the team so the teams can see how they're performing? So again, the analytics plays a large role in not just the identifying opportunity for clinical variation, but also being able to sustain a clinical variation program. We talked a lot about the physician and provider engagement and championing the process. Again, the physicians are the champions of the evidence-based medicine. Also, the additional disciplines sitting at the table bring evidence-based recommendations to the table, i.e. dietary, pharmacy, nursing, ancillaries, therapies, all contribute to best practices, not just physicians, but very much an interdisciplinary team. So at this time, we're going to just share some examples of how organizations have leveraged their data to create insight, using their data as a strategic insight. So we start with conducting the baseline analysis. This is where we size the clinical variation opportunity. This usually takes about 30 days. It's going to take the patient level and the charge level data. It's going to bring it together and essentially quantify how much potential variation there is within a number of like homogeneous populations, whether you're looking at a group of diagnoses or a group of procedures. And then it's designing the right fit analytics to ensure that when the teams are studying the clinical variation, that we can provide that drillable insight to that team and provide those on-demand reports that those teams need to see on an ongoing basis. So essentially, it's creating standard work within business intelligence to drive this clinical variation approach. The data processing piece should not put any burden on the IT department, because most modern day EMRs have the ability to extract the patient level data. We typically recommend 2 years of data as an export from your EMR, and then also the same period of time for the charge level database that would come from your transaction data from your finance team. So it's bringing all these data together and ensuring that we have, again, the ability to create a holistic approach to clinical variation. There is a lot to the data processing if you're just beginning to organize the data, and this is something you can easily outsource or work with your internal teams to develop. It's collecting the data, preparing it, creating the data models, validating the data so it ticks and ties, and also beginning that analysis. Again, a lot of preparation goes in for the readiness of clinical variation. I think everyone on the listening to this webinar would agree. There's just a lot of moving parts. Once we have the platform developed, the data is coming together, we can quantify where is that variation. This is just an example of that. We can look at that clinical variation vertically, horizontally. We can look at that variation by a department, or we can look at that variation by a clinical cohort. We can identify that potential benefit opportunity. How much variation? We can apply some numbers and goals throughout the process. There are also a number of cost-saving methods to be able to realize that cost savings. One of the ways we do that is to study the variation around the mean and attempting to drive that variability or those variation curves. And that's can be quantified, which we call method A, bringing the variation above the mean a little closer to the mean. There are some projects, however, that you may wish to utilize what we call method C, which is the Hawthorne effect, that your goal is to reduce variation across that cohort. You're trying to reduce that excess dollar, excess direct cost, or maybe excess days, whatever you're looking at, or excess mortality or excess readmission. You're trying to move the needle and improve that by a percentage. So there's different methods to create the cost savings opportunity, and one method is you can use a multiple of methods depending on the nature of the project. So again, presenting the variation curves in a non-judgmental way is so critical. Clinical variation studies are not meant to be judgmental. It's really all about trust with the medical staff and the teams, and having discussions around what is best practice. Again, it's not trying to look at good doctor, bad doctor. It's really looking at the whole process. So this reflection point focuses in on the drillable analytics. You've seen some examples of preparing the data and beginning to identify opportunities of clinical variation. What level of confidence do you have in your organization's ability to provide those drillable analytics? Low confidence, good, high confidence? During the implementation phase of clinical variation, it's important that we measure change and we share those changes with all of the key stakeholders. One of a great way to present a change is through the use of control charts. Control charts include the upper and lower controls, the mean, and it really provides some important statistical process controls around where that change might be occurring. So that's just a really great way to share back information in the form of change and trends. Another way we use to feedback information is through the use of operational uh, financial statements or profit and loss. So we can share that information with teams over time and be able to drill into those directs and indirects and even revenue drivers. We often use bubble charts to present the data because it provides the ability to look at three variables. Your X and your Y axis and your bubble size is that third variable. So that combination of trending, P&Ls, and bubble charts to study the variation are very, very powerful. Again, clinical variation takes a holistic approach. We don't want to lose sight of other indicators that might be impacted because of the changes we're making, such as how is our mortality, our morbidity, our readmission rates, what's the impact of our length of stay over time, what's the impact of our case mix. So we want to create a holistic approach to the study of clinical variation. And this is an example of what we call a storyboard. These storyboards can be printed from the clinical intelligence platform. They can really be drilled upon by different dimensions, creating a storyboard around sepsis, for example, or a storyboard around just a physician cohort. So the storyboards can be very customized. Another report we utilize to study clinical variation is really important, and this is what we call the resource utilization summary. This allows us to drill into the revenue and cost centers, look at the average direct cost of that activity, and compare those costs between providers to get some insight on practice patterns and where the patterns might vary. And this does often trigger discussions among the physician groups and that healthy discussion that we like. Another process in clinical variation is what we refer to as process mapping, is where we can identify an opportunity, potentially quantify the variation, but then break down that cohort into components. So this is looking at heart failure. What is the total spend? What is the variation curve opportunity or that method A or method B or C that we've identified? In this case, for this example, it's 724,000. Well, how does this break down on a per capita cost? And that's what we want to get to, is how do you break this down? What is the average direct cost of each patient? And then what are the costs within each of those cost driving departments, lab, pharmacy, intensive care, etc. This is just an example of a process map that really helps identify the opportunity, but then really focusing in on the drivers of that change. Again, this benefit opportunity is another example of a tool that we use to identify the variation. This is quantifying the variation curves and translating that into dollars based on direct cost opportunity, and creating really a pick list. So we can kind of see in this example, major hip and knee is showing a potential impact. And this allows us to use this as a good starting point. All right, now that we've talked about the readiness of clinical variation, we wanted to share with you some examples of how to identify a potential clinical variation opportunity and drill into that opportunity to create some storyboards and some meaningful, actionable analytics. So here's what you see on the screen is a potential impact summary. It's ranking these opportunities by potential impact. We've talked about the different methodologies of quantifying clinical variation, whether you're using the Hawthorne or above the mean, to the mean, whatever methodology you're using, you're determining what that potential impact is. So we're going to look at major hip and knee replacement of the lower extremity, and then we'll also look at sepsis as examples, one medical, one surgical. And we've created some bookmarks here. So we're going to look at the clinical cohort of knee, and we're going to be looking at about 200 cases of these knee replacements. These are primary osteoarthritis, left and right knee. So what we try to do is attempt to create a homogeneous population. So we're really studying like clinical cohorts. Another way we can create that normalization of the data is we can look at this from a severity of illness and risk adjust the data. We can look at different outliers and remove certain outliers. Here we're looking at the distribution of these patients. Each patient is a dot on this scattergram, and we're seeing that dispersion around the mean, and then also looking at the different length of stay. So you see your length of stay of 1, 2, 3, 4 days, or some of those knee replacements stayed more than 6 days. So you can trim those as outliers, for example, if you wish. 200 cases, 11.7 million charges, 2.9 payments. Our average direct cost, we want to keep our eye on that, is the $11,702. Again, that was derived from what cost accounting methodology you have in place. We can see that average direct cost distribution on this bubble chart, and we see that reference line, that $12,000 is indicating that average. We can also see the providers, the surgeons above the mean. You can see that highest volume surgeon has higher costs, $13,000. We also have another surgeon has another $14,000, and then we have some providers that are under that mean. So we really want to try to explain what's driving this variation. Is it clinical variation, or is it practice? We can check that medical surgical supply, that's 1.7 million on the left there, and we can just isolate that focus. So when you bring your clinical consensus teams together, you're certainly going to want to have your supply chain expert in the room and your OR expert. So now we're going to look at the medical surgical supplies, the 1.7 million of spend, and we're going to just look at the distribution of this. We can see the severity of the illness in these cases. We can see the average direct costs for this supply category is $8,600, and the direct cost is 1.7, the spend. So again, it's looking at the revenue center, the drivers of the cost, and pulling together the disciplines that can help explain the costs and identify opportunities. So now we are looking at sepsis, and we've again gone through the process of ensuring a homogeneous population as best as possible, take out outliers, risk adjust the data, making sure we look at, there's different types of sepsis, of course. So this is by nature a very high variation condition. So there'll always be variation in sepsis. But we do take the same approach, looking at the variation of the cost and how they're dispersed around the mean. We again look at the direct cost and drill down into those. but we also want to keep our eye on quality. And um, we can, we know when we look at the quality of sepsis, we're looking at the different types of classification of sepsis, sepsis and severe sepsis and septic shock. They're all within the DRG, but there are different classifications of that. So it's really important that we understand how to clinically segment data and understand how to risk stratify the data, not just by case mix or APR severity of illness or risk of mortality, but by the nature of the different classifications. So creating a storyboard, we can see that we're going to be focusing on the volume, the clinical documentation to ensure that we have sepsis defined. We'll look at the efficiency of sepsis as it relates to throughput and discharge planning and use of the post-acute continuum from a care management perspective. We'll also quantify what is that potential excess day opportunity, length of stay index, excess days. We'll take a close examination of mortality and morbidity and the management of rehospitalizations. So again, it's a holistic approach to the study of clinical variation as it relates to sepsis. Again, we'll look at physician report cards and scorecards that help us understand the drivers, and we'll work here specifically to implement best practices around how to manage that 1 hour bundle, 3 hour bundle, etc. Here we are looking at laboratory. And we can see the distribution of each of those activities within laboratory and easily see the practice patterns for the treatment of sepsis. So the blood glucose monitoring is so important within the diabetic population. The monitoring of the CBCs, magnesiums, BMP, the blood cultures. You can see that distribution of all those tests being done. So these are some examples of utilizing business intelligence to identify the opportunity, to identify the cost and quality drivers for that opportunity, and to be able to create an ongoing trending. So those are some examples of getting ready for a program and some things to think about as you reflect on your own program. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Doug Morell. And Doug's going to really speak on the 3 critical success steps of a cost accounting program. Doug?
Thank you, Laurie. Hello, everyone. So let's first of all start out to talk about the cost accounting transformation benefits. A lot has been written over the past decade and even more about the importance of accurate and timely cost information. And this need for cost data in healthcare has become even more acute in the current environment. As a matter of fact, it seems to become more acute every day with the various pressures on your organizations on the revenue side and also on the cost side. So to respond to those needs of what you need to know for value-based care, organizations really must know and trust their cost of care across the continuum. And this has become very important and very useful in CVR efforts. So clinicians that study care variation require a high degree of transparency into the data used to calculate cost. And the days of general cost allocation spread over patient populations and based on subjective criteria are really behind us. Organizational leadership needs to have a high degree of confidence in their cost data to make informed decisions. So what we use to depict the analytics environment is this pyramid. Enterprise cost accounting is the bridge between the volumes of available patient and business data at the bottom and the ability to provide effective analysis of the cost to provide care, including profitability of any patient cohort, as depicted up at the top of the pyramid. We use this to demonstrate how cost accounting fits in an analytic environment. We want to leverage the best data available within the organization to deliver the highest quality information to the decision makers. So, as we look at cost accounting, there is an evolution in confidence level that we have here. Cost accounting in healthcare came out of the shadows with the advent of DRGs in 1985. Ratio of cost to charge, or RCC, was the quick and easy way to determine cost. DRG payment schemes made the shortcomings of RCC obvious, yet 35 years later, a large percentage of US hospitals have either no cost accounting capability or still rely on RCC method for cost accounting. So cost accounting science has evolved into using relative value units, or RVUs, and more recently to leverage the vast amounts of EMR data captured on every patient, which we call advanced cost accounting or event-based cost accounting. But before we embark on a clinical variation reduction effort, we need to assess the quality of the organization's cost accounting. Where is it on the cost accounting spectrum? From no cost accounting to RCC, or maybe in advanced costing? And what capabilities and resources does the organization have to improve the quality of its cost accounting information? All right, so let's take a look at this reflection number 3. So what level of confidence do you have in your cost accounting data for the study of CVR? Low confidence in our costing data. In other words, you may not have a costing system, or you use ratio of cost to charge. You have some confidence in the cost data. Maybe you're using relative value units or some combination with RCC, or we have high confidence in our cost data. It's been very thoroughly vetted. We're using activity-based costing or some other methods to derive the best quality or best type of cost possible. Of course, and maybe you don't really even know about your cost accounting. Okay, when we look at the phases of a cost accounting program, there's really 3 major phases involved. One is what we like to do is first a rapid assessment of the current state. So we want to understand where you are with cost accounting historically and at the current time. The second is an implementation phase, so we can look at getting you up to speed on where you need to be on cost accounting. And the third objective there is to keep the data current and accurate through a sustained phase with ongoing maintenance and other efforts. So to look at these in a little bit more detail on the next slide, the cost accounting assessment is an assessment of your current cost accounting and analytics environment. We want to talk to the C-suite members as well as heads of key clinical areas such as surgery, pharmacy, lab, and imaging. We'll also talk to IT, finance, and supply chain. And we'll deliver a comprehensive report identifying any gaps standing in the way of a thorough CVR implementation. And we indicate the level of confidence which can be gained as a result of improving the cost accounting information. Now, in terms of implementation of this, of course, is heavily dependent on what you need to do to get really improved costing information. But we design the implementation phase to be as quick and precise as possible. And we recognize that cost accounting may have a negative connotation historically, and that everyone is very busy with their regular day jobs. Cost accounting is the last thing they want to do. But we have a process that respects the time of all involved while obtaining the data essential for a successful project. So that involves data collection, getting the data sources ready from the various places, where in IT or finance is it going to come from, talking to the various clinicians and department heads to understand their operation, how they deliver care to a patient, and how we can model cost drivers based on their operation. Then we compile the data and prepare documentation, build the various tables, fit that all into the cost system as required, and then integrate the cost and audit, reconcile, and feedback that cost into your analytics platform. Okay, so in terms of sustainability, this is frequently where cost accounting falls down at most organizations that have undertaken a costing effort. I like to say that cost accounting is a lot like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. As soon as you finish, you have to start over from the beginning. It's not something that functions well on autopilot. It needs attention and to adapt to the changing environment within the organization. Some of the keys to a successful cost accounting program are a dedicated resource. Frequently with cost accounting, we see that the cost accountant is a good, say, a productivity person or a good budget person or a good financial analyst. And soon they get siphoned off onto other projects and cost accounting falls by the wayside. So you need to have a dedicated resource, either inside the institution or outside, that can keep the cost accounting system up to date. You also need to have a regular process and cadence so that people know when to expect the new cost accounting results. Is that quarterly, is that monthly, or whatever? The cost accounting team needs to stay current on new activities and charges and procedures as they get developed and come through the system. And then you need to have rigorous auditing, reconciliation, and problem remediation built into the process. So all of these things working together should give you a very solid cost accounting process.
Well, thank you, Doug. That was really helpful. And at this stage of the presentation, just wanted to provide some recaps. We've talked a lot about the vision of clinical variation and the programmatic approach to establishing the data, the charters, making sure the teams are ready. Doug's talked about the importance of costing through the assessment, implementation, and sustain phase. And now that 45 minutes have gone by, I think you're ready to launch your program. So what we're going to be talking about in phase 2 of the clinical variation strategy in July are the details and nuts and bolts on how to launch your program. We're going to cover the activation phase, which we will leverage what we've just developed in the readiness phase. We'll be selecting one of our projects as our example and developing out a process and leveraging that DMAIC methodology we talked about to study clinical variation. We're also going to share some examples of all the reports and for you to be successful in your clinical variation programs. And that sustain phase is the last phase of our project, and that's when you've implemented your clinical variation process, which typically takes about 3 months. We try to look at a project within 3 months to 6 months to build it. But your sustain phase is ongoing. This is where you've hardwired your best practices, you've implemented those change processes, and now you're studying the impacts of that change or that work plan. There's no end to clinical variation. It's just a continuous performance improvement process. However, you might have stabilized the process that you're ready to begin another focus area over time. So we're looking forward to inviting you back to our phase 2 clinical variation, and we'll leave you with a reflection around your own clinical variation program. Thinking about your gaps in your successful program. Do you have the structure and the governance and the leadership oversight to drive the program? Do you have the right analytics and costing data for you to size your opportunity and processes to drill into the data of the variation? And are you sustaining the outcomes that you desire? So just reflecting on this and recapping, um, we are available for any key questions. We have some contact information here included. We know we haven't personally met you, but we wish you all the best with your clinical variation program, and look forward to hopefully meeting you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Laurie and Doug for this excellent and insightful presentation. I am so excited to, I can't wait to the next month to hear part 2 to the activation phase. And we invite all of you to join us. Again, if anyone has any further questions or want any further information, or if I can introduce you to this awesome team at Clinical Intelligence, please reach out to me. You've got my phone number on the screen, my email information. And again, this is just so insightful and so eye-opening. So thank you again.
Well, thanks, Robin, for the opportunity. We appreciate it.
Okay, looking forward to seeing you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.